In the small, fog-covered village of Oak Hollow, there was a tradition as old as the village itself. Each year, as the cold October nights stretched longer and Halloween drew near, families would place carved pumpkins, Jack's pumpkins, as they were called, on their porches, their eerie faces glowing with candlelight. But there was a rule that every villager knew, whispered through generations: remove the pumpkins before dawn, or they will claim you. No one quite remembered when or why the tradition began, only that it had always been this way. Stories circulated every year, often dismissed as old superstitions, about villagers who had forgotten or refused to bring their pumpkins inside before sunrise. The following morning, they were never quite the same. Some moved away, never to be heard from again. Others simply stayed silent, their eyes hollow, their faces etched with an unspoken terror. This year, like every other, the village was preparing for the festival, and every house was adorned with pumpkins. At first glance, Oak Hollow seemed like any other small village. But for those who lived there, the weight of tradition hung heavy. Except for a small group of teenagers, Alex, Rachel, Matt, and Jenny, who were restless with the old ways. For them, the stories were nothing but tales meant to scare children. Alex, the leader of the group, was the first to suggest the idea. What if we leave ours out? You know, just to prove it's all nonsense. The others laughed, though nervously. Rachel tugged at her sweater sleeves, looking toward the horizon, where the first hints of the harvest moon began to rise. Are you sure about this? I mean, what if there's a reason for the stories? Rachel, come on, Matt scoffed, though there was an uneasy note in his voice. It's just an old legend. Pumpkins don't come to life. But Jenny, the quietest of the group, shifted uneasily. My grandmother always said the ones who stayed behind were the ones who challenged the old ways. Alex, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. That's exactly what they want you to believe. I bet nothing will happen. We'll leave our pumpkins out tonight, and we'll all meet up tomorrow morning, alive and well. With that, the decision was made. They each had carved their pumpkins earlier that evening, faces twisted into grim, toothy grins, eyes narrowed into menacing shapes, and placed them proudly on their porches. The night air was sharp and cool as the wind rustled through the bare branches of the trees. As they parted ways, promising to meet the next morning, an unsettling quiet settled over the village. The streets, once filled with laughter and anticipation, now seemed eerily still. The moonlight cast long shadows over the pumpkins, making their faces appear even more grotesque. At home, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. She stared at her pumpkin through the window, its flickering candlelight barely visible against the encroaching darkness. The others, too, found themselves lying awake, glancing toward their porches, half expecting, though they would never admit it, that something might move in the night. As the clock struck midnight, the village fell into an uneasy silence. And though none of them spoke about it until later, each of them heard a faint rustling outside their windows. The kind that makes you sit up in bed, straining to hear, unsure if it's real or just the wind. But Oak Hollow was a place where traditions weren't easily broken. And by morning, they would all understand why. Morning broke over Oak Hollow with a heavy, gray sky, and the crispness of autumn lingered in the air. The village, usually bustling by this hour, with children running through the streets and neighbors exchanging greetings, seemed oddly subdued. There was something different in the atmosphere, something that no one wanted to say out loud. Rachel was the first to wake, her eyes fluttering open to the pale morning light filtering through her curtains. For a moment, everything seemed normal. She lay there in the stillness, listening to the familiar sounds of her house, the groan of the old floorboards, the soft creak of the wind pushing against the windows. But then she remembered the pumpkins, and her stomach dropped. Slowly, she slid out of bed and padded to the window. From the second floor, she had a clear view of the porch below. Her pumpkin sat exactly where she had left it, its twisted face still visible, though the candle had long since burned out. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance, no signs of movement, no strange footprints in the dirt. And yet, something was different. The face. She pressed her nose closer to the glass, squinting. It had changed, hadn't it? The crooked grin seemed wider, the eyes more sunken, almost as if they had deepened overnight. She pulled back quickly, her heart beating faster, and shook her head. It's just your imagination, she told herself. Pumpkins don't change on their own. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. She decided to call Alex. On the other end of town, Alex had woken with the same strange unease. He had been dreaming all night, vivid, unsettling dreams that he couldn't quite remember, but that left him feeling disoriented. When his phone buzzed with Rachel's name, he picked it up, trying to sound casual. Morning. So, did you see anything? Rachel hesitated. No. I mean, it's still there. But it looks different. Alex laughed, though it came out more forced than he intended. That's what happens when you stay up late worrying about nothing. It's just a pumpkin. I know, she replied, though her voice was softer. But, can we meet up? I feel like we should check in with the others. Alex agreed, though he couldn't quite shake the strange, gnawing feeling in his gut. As he pulled on his jacket and headed out the door, he glanced back at his own pumpkin. Its face seemed to mock him from the porch, the candle inside long extinguished. By the time Alex, Rachel, Matt, and Jenny gathered at the small cafe on Main Street, the village was beginning to stir, but the usual cheer of a Halloween morning was missing. People moved quietly, heads down, as if they, too, felt the strange weight in the air. Matt arrived last, looking pale and sleep-deprived. He didn't sit down immediately, instead glancing around nervously. Did you guys notice anything weird? He asked, lowering his voice. Rachel exchanged a look with Alex. What do you mean? Matt shifted uncomfortably. My pumpkin. I swear, it was facing the other direction when I woke up this morning. I didn't touch it. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. Mine looked different too. Jenny, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. We shouldn't have done it, she whispered, her voice trembling. My grandmother, she told me about this. She said once you break the rule, once you challenge them, they come for you. Alex rolled his eyes, though his heart was racing. Come on, Jenny. They're just pumpkins. But Jenny shook her head. Not just pumpkins. She said they're part of something older. Something we don't understand. The group sat in uneasy silence, the weight of Jenny's words settling over them like a cloud. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the leaves and sending a soft, eerie whistle through the air. I'm going to go check on mine, Alex said suddenly, standing up. Just to prove nothing's happening. Without waiting for a response, he left the cafe, his footsteps hurried as he made his way back to his house. The others followed reluctantly, a strange, shared dread creeping into their minds. As they neared Alex's house, the feeling grew stronger. Something wasn't right. His pumpkin sat on the porch, just as it had been before. But now, in the harsh light of day, the grin looked sharper, more menacing. And there, on the porch steps, was something none of them had expected, long, thin scratches, as if something had crawled its way across the wood in the night. Rachel gasped. What is that?" Alex froze, his bravado vanishing in an instant. The scratches were deep, unmistakable. And as they stood there, the wind picked up again, blowing through the hollow eyes of the pumpkin, making a low, groaning sound that sent shivers down their spines. No one spoke. No one dared to. But in that moment, they all knew something had woken up. And it wasn't just the pumpkins. The days in Oak Hollow had always followed a predictable rhythm, slow and unhurried, like the gentle drift of autumn leaves. But now, after what they had seen, time seemed to stretch in a way that none of them could explain. Every second felt weighted, every breath shallow, as if the air itself had thickened with an unseen tension. Alex couldn't stop staring at the scratches on his porch. He traced his fingers over the marks again and again, half expecting to feel something, heat, cold, a pulse beneath the wood. But it was just wood, lifeless and unyielding. The pumpkin beside him sat unmoving, its face twisted into that same mocking grin. They all stood there, silent. The quiet between them was unnatural, heavy, as if they were all waiting for something to happen, for the world to tilt just slightly and spill them into whatever strange nightmare had begun. It was Matt who finally broke the silence. "I think we need to go to the old woman's house," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the ground. Rachel looked at him sharply. "What old woman?" "Jenny's grandmother," he said, barely above a whisper. "She's the one who knows about all this. We should have listened to her." Jenny, standing a few feet away, stiffened. Her hands were buried deep in her coat pockets, her face pale and drawn. "She doesn't talk to people anymore," Jenny said flatly. "Not after what happened last year." "What happened last year?" Alex asked, but Jenny shook her head, her lips pressed together tightly. She wouldn't meet his eyes. There was something else going on here, something deeper than old superstitions and scratched porch steps. Alex had known Jenny for years, but she had never mentioned anything about her grandmother or what had happened last Halloween. It wasn't like her to keep secrets. Yet here she was, as closed off as a locked door, and whatever had caused the shift in her demeanor, it was enough to make him uneasy. The wind blew through the trees again, stirring the brittle branches above them. The sky had darkened, though it was only mid-morning, casting the village in a strange, eerie light. The pumpkins, which should have looked festive, now seemed grotesque. Their faces leered at the group from every porch, their once harmless expressions twisted into something menacing, something that no longer belonged in the world of the living. Alex felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, and suddenly, the idea of talking to Jenny's grandmother didn't seem so ridiculous after all. "We should go," he said finally, his voice firmer than he felt. "If she knows something, we need to hear it." Jenny hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the horizon where the sky was thickening with clouds. But finally, she nodded. "Fine. I'll take you." They made their way through the village, the wind whispering strange things through the trees, the shadows growing long and distorted as they walked. The streets were nearly empty now, as though the rest of the town had retreated indoors, leaving the four of them alone to face whatever was lurking in the dark corners of Oak Hollow. Jenny's grandmother lived on the far edge of the village, in a small, crumbling house that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The windows were thick with dust, the garden overgrown with weeds. It didn't look like a place where anyone lived, but Jenny strode up the narrow path with purpose, her eyes fixed on the door. She knocked, 3 sharp raps, and waited. For a long time, there was no answer, only the sound of the wind moaning through the broken trees around them. Alex shifted uneasily, glancing back toward the road, half expecting something, he didn't know what, to come crawling out of the woods. Finally, the door creaked open, just a crack, and an old, withered hand appeared, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Jenny's grandmother was ancient, her face lined with deep creases, her eyes cloudy but sharp beneath the veil of cataracts. She didn't look surprised to see them. "You've come," she said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "I knew you would." Jenny swallowed hard. "We need your help." The old woman's gaze slid over each of them, her expression unreadable. She opened the door wider and stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. Inside, the house was dim, the air thick with the smell of earth and something else, something metallic, like old pennies. They followed her into the cramped living room, where a fire crackled low in the hearth. Above the mantel, dried herbs hung in clusters, their brittle leaves rustling faintly as the air stirred. "You broke the rule," the old woman said suddenly, her voice hard. "And now they've woken up." Jenny flinched. "We didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant," the old woman snapped. "They don't care for intentions." Rachel shifted uneasily. Who's they?" The old woman turned slowly, her eyes fixing on Rachel with a cold intensity. "The ones who live in the shadows. The ones we've kept at bay for generations. The pumpkins are their masks, their doorways. When you leave them out past dawn, you invite them in." The room felt suddenly colder. Alex opened his mouth to argue, to laugh it off, but the words died in his throat. There was something about the way the old woman spoke, something about the darkness in her eyes, that made him believe her. "They're already here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "And now, they've come for you." The air in the old woman's house was thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Alex could hear his heart pounding in his chest, a steady, persistent rhythm that matched the low crackle of the fire. No one spoke. Even Rachel, who had always been the loudest in the group, stood silent, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Jenny's grandmother moved slowly across the room, her steps deliberate, the creak of her bones audible in the silence. She stood before the fire, her back to the group, staring into the flickering flames as if they held answers no one else could see. "They've been waiting," she said, her voice soft now, almost mournful. "All it takes is one mistake. One crack in the door, and they'll find their way through." Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room. "This is crazy," she muttered under her breath, but her voice lacked conviction. Jenny didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at the back of her grandmother's head, her hands clenched at her sides. Alex wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, but something held him back, an invisible barrier of fear that kept him rooted in place. "What do we do?" Alex finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old woman turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "You think you can undo this?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You've already crossed the threshold." Alex swallowed hard. "But there must be something." "There's nothing you can do," she cut him off, her voice final. "You invited them in. Now, you'll have to live with the consequences." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the dried herbs hanging above the mantel. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. Alex felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his stomach. This was all wrong. They had been playing with a silly tradition, testing the boundaries of an old superstition. But now, the stakes felt far too real, far too dangerous. "They'll come for each of you," the old woman continued, her voice low and steady. "One by one. And there's nothing you can do to stop it." Jenny flinched as if she'd been struck. "But we didn't mean..." "Intentions don't matter," her grandmother said, her gaze hard. "You played with forces you don't understand. Rachel took a step back, her face pale. "This is insane," she muttered again, louder this time, her voice trembling. "We're just talking about pumpkins. They're just things we carved." The old woman laughed then, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed through the room like breaking glass. "Do you really think they're just pumpkins? Those faces you carved, do you even remember what they looked like when you finished? Do you know what you invited into your world?" Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was, none of them could quite remember the exact details of the faces they had carved. The more they tried to picture them, the blurrier the images became, as if the pumpkins themselves had taken on lives of their own the moment the knives had touched them. "I tried to warn you," the old woman said softly, her voice almost sad. "But it's too late now." Outside, the wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows in their frames. Alex could feel the temperature in the room drop, a sudden, biting cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a second skin. "Is there any way to stop them?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling. The old woman shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "They're already here. You can't stop them, but you can survive. If you're careful." "How?" Alex asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The old woman didn't answer right away. She turned back to the fire, her fingers twitching at her sides. "Stay inside," she said finally. "Don't leave your homes after dark. And don't look too closely at the shadows." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Alex's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. How could shadows be dangerous? How could a simple tradition of carved pumpkins lead to something so terrifying? But the old woman's warning echoed in his mind, and he knew, deep down, that they had stepped into something far beyond their understanding. "We should go," Matt said suddenly, his voice breaking the tension. "We need to get out of here." Rachel nodded quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, let's go." Jenny hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on her grandmother, but then she turned and followed the others toward the door. As they stepped outside, the wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a low, eerie whisper that seemed to follow them. Alex glanced back at the house, at the dark windows and the figure of Jenny's grandmother silhouetted against the light from the fire. Her words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. Don't look too closely at the shadows. As they walked down the narrow path, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The trees loomed tall and twisted above them, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The pumpkins on the porches, once harmless symbols of Halloween, now seemed to be watching them with malevolent eyes, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions of glee. Alex quickened his pace, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He didn't dare look back again. He didn't want to see what might be lurking in the shadows behind them. By the time they reached the edge of the village, the air had grown heavier, the sky darkening prematurely as thick clouds rolled in, swallowing the fading light. Alex, Matt, Rachel, and Jenny moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves that blanketed the ground. No one spoke. The weight of the old woman's words clung to them like a shroud. Alex glanced sideways at Jenny, who was walking slightly ahead, her face set in a hard, determined expression. He could see the tension in the way she moved, her fists clenched, her shoulders rigid. Rachel and Matt, trailing just behind, looked equally uneasy, their heads down, eyes scanning the ground as if afraid to look up at what might be waiting in the growing darkness. The houses they passed were eerily quiet. The jack-o'-lanterns that still sat on the porches seemed to leer at them, their twisted faces casting long shadows across the ground. Alex couldn't help but shiver. The carved pumpkins looked different now, more sinister, more alive, as if they were waiting for something. He didn't dare look too closely at their faces, remembering the old woman's warning. They reached a small clearing where the path split off toward their individual homes, and for a moment, they all hesitated, standing in a circle, no one willing to break the uneasy silence that had fallen over them. "Do you think," Rachel began, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think she was serious about the shadows?" Matt snorted, though the sound lacked conviction. "Come on, Ratch. It's just a bunch of old folklore. Pumpkins coming to life? Shadows creeping up on us? It's Halloween. This is what people do to freak each other out." Alex wanted to agree, wanted to shake off the chill that had settled deep inside him, but something in the old woman's voice had struck him, something real. Her words hadn't felt like a mere story meant to scare them. They had felt like a warning. "We shouldn't have left the pumpkins out," Jenny said quietly, breaking the silence. She turned to face the group, her face pale in the fading light. "We should have listened." Matt rolled his eyes. "Come on, Jenny. We left some pumpkins on the porch." "So what? They're just things. Tomorrow, we'll throw them away, and this will all be over." But Alex wasn't so sure. He could still feel it, the eyes of those carved faces, watching from the shadows of the porches, waiting. And something told him that it wasn't over. Not yet. Rachel shifted nervously, glancing up at the sky where the clouds continued to thicken, the wind picking up, howling through the trees like distant laughter. "Maybe we should go inside," she suggested. "Just to be safe." Matt shrugged, though Alex could see the unease in his eyes. "Fine. But I'm telling you, this is all in our heads." The group began to disperse, each turning toward their respective homes, but Alex hesitated. A strange sense of dread had settled over him, the kind that made his skin crawl, as if something unseen were brushing up against him. He turned to look down the road, toward the center of the village, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker of something shifting in the shadows. His heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Jenny asked, stopping just ahead of him. Alex shook his head, not trusting his own eyes. "Nothing," he murmured. But he didn't believe it. Something was out there, hiding just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting. They made their way back to their houses, each of them parting ways at the crossroads, the distance between them growing as they neared their own homes. Alex felt the unease grow with every step he took. The wind had become colder, biting against his skin, and the pumpkins, those grinning faces on the porches, seemed to leer at him with even more intensity, as if mocking his fear. When he finally reached his front door, he fumbled with the key, his fingers numb and clumsy. His eyes darted to the pumpkin sitting on his own porch, the one he had carved with such careless abandon just days before. Its face was a crude grin, wide and jagged, but now, in the growing gloom, it looked less like a decoration and more like something aware. Alex forced himself to look away as he unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him with more force than necessary. The house was dark, and the familiar sounds of his home, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, did little to calm his nerves. He stood in the foyer for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and every now and then, he thought he heard something else, a low, scraping sound, like claws against wood. His heart pounded in his chest. He moved to the window, careful not to let himself be seen, and peered out into the darkness. The street was empty. The other houses were dark, their windows closed, their curtains drawn. The pumpkins on the porches seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, their faces grotesque and menacing. And then he saw it. Just at the edge of the porch, near the bottom step, something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, a flicker of motion in the shadows. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying trees. But then it moved again, a slow, deliberate shift, as if something, or someone, was watching him from just beyond the light. Alex backed away from the window, his heart racing. His mind raced through the old woman's words, the story she had told them about what happened when the pumpkins were left out overnight. He had laughed it off then, but now, the fear gnawed at him, real and sharp. Don't look too closely at the shadows. He could still hear her voice, echoing in his mind. But it was too late for that. He had already looked. And whatever was out there, in the darkness, had seen him too. That night, the village fell into an unsettling quiet. No laughter from the children, no distant chatter from neighbors. The air hung heavy with an anticipation that Alex couldn't shake, a feeling that something was waiting, something inevitable. Alex sat in his room, the door firmly locked, though he knew it wouldn't stop anything if it wanted to come in. He tried to distract himself, flipping through an old book, but the words swam in front of his eyes, meaningless. Every creak of the house made his heart jump, and the wind outside seemed to carry strange whispers, like voices just out of reach. As the hours stretched into the night, he found himself drawn again and again to the window. He didn't want to look, but the compulsion was too strong. He had to know if it was still there. Each time he peeked through the curtain, the street outside remained empty, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. Just the pumpkins on the porches, their carved faces glowing eerily in the moonlight. But then, as the clock ticked past midnight, something changed. At first, it was subtle. A rustling sound, faint but distinct, coming from the porch. Alex froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, like something scraping against the wood, moving slowly, deliberately. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat tightening with fear. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling as he approached the window. He didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to hide, to pretend he hadn't heard anything. But the pull was too strong. Slowly, he lifted the curtain, just enough to peek outside. At first, he saw nothing, just the empty porch and the jack-o'-lantern sitting on the step, its grin as wide and menacing as ever. But then, just as he was about to turn away, it happened. The pumpkin moved. It was slight, just a small shift, but unmistakable. The carved face seemed to twist, the grin widening, the eyes narrowing as if it were watching him. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, convinced it was just his imagination, but when he looked again, the pumpkin had shifted even more. It was no longer sitting on the step. It was standing. On what appeared to be thin, spindly legs, the pumpkin stood upright, its grotesque face turned toward the window. Alex felt a wave of cold terror wash over him. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what he had just seen. But there was no time to think. The sound of scratching against the door echoed through the house. Alex's eyes shot toward the front door. The scraping noise was slow, methodical, like claws dragging across the wood. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he thought he was going to be sick. He backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The pumpkin. It was no longer on the porch. It was inside. Standing in the hallway, its grotesque face turned toward him, the jagged grin impossibly wide, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It stood on its spindly legs, a twisted mockery of a living thing, and slowly, it began to move toward him, step by step. Alex stumbled backward, his mind reeling, his body frozen with fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The pumpkin crept closer, its grin widening, its glowing eyes fixed on him, unblinking. It seemed to grow larger with each step, its presence filling the room, suffocating him with its weight. In the distance, he heard more sounds, more scratching, more scraping. From the windows, from the walls. They were all around him now. The pumpkins, the creations they had carved in jest, had come to life, and they were coming for him. He backed into a corner, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with terror. The pumpkin loomed over him, its jagged face inches from his own, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to that one horrible moment, the creature's glowing eyes locking onto his. And then, it spoke. A low, guttural sound, more like a growl than a voice. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. It had come for him. For all of them. And there was no escape. The door creaked open behind him, and Alex felt a rush of cold air as the night poured into the room. He turned, but it was too late. The darkness closed in around him, and the last thing he saw was the grinning face of the pumpkin, glowing in the shadows, as the world slipped away. The next morning, the village was silent. The sun rose, casting a warm, golden light over the houses, the streets, and the porches where the pumpkins still sat, their faces grinning serenely in the daylight. No one noticed the absence of the 4 teenagers at first. It wasn't until later that day, when their parents began to search for them, that the truth became clear. But by then, it was too late. The pumpkins had been removed from the porches, as they always were. The village continued its traditions, its routines, unaware of what had happened in the night. But the old woman knew. She watched from her window, her eyes scanning the empty streets, her face grim. She had warned them. She had told them the stories. And now, as she looked out at the smiling jack-o'-lanterns, she knew that they had not listened. And she knew that, come next Halloween, the pumpkins would smile again.